Even though multiple forces are working really hard to undermine both the image and the reality of the country, the United States of America still remains exceptional in many ways and a source of greatness. With that said, exceptional doesn't mean perfect. Just because a lot of criticism levied against our American friends by the agents of totalitarianism are oftentimes wrong or misplaced, that doesn't mean nothing's wrong. So what are the things where the US falls short? Are there any of them fixable? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is part 2 in a way. After discussing 10 things that rock about the United States, now it's time to discuss 10 things that suck, and where possible we'll also discuss ways to remedy or alleviate those said things. Just like in the first part, it's just one man's opinion, so don't take it too hard, not to mention that it is the opinion of a man with quite abnormal tastes as well. The comparison will be, for the most part, with Europe or with other countries in the deck of 100 or so that I've seen so far. Of course, you'll also be watching some footage that I've taken during my USA tour. Anyways, as usual, I don't claim my list is complete or definitive, and I don't claim to know everything about everything. So, with that said, let us begin. Number 1. Zoning laws. You saw that coming, didn't you? Or more broadly, the shocking level of authoritarianism by local authorities. I've spoken in the video about the debt on the issue of zoning laws, and also a year and a half ago about that terrible case in Chicago where the city hall essentially said it is preferable for homeless people to freeze to death in the streets than to break or work around the precious city code on shelters and allow good Samaritans to do whatever they damn please on their property. But it's more than that. Zoning laws are at the origin of a lot of current problems plaguing the United States. Zoning laws are what make the construction of affordable homes in many areas impossible. And what affected me personally the most, zoning laws are what make it impossible to have a convenience store within walking distance. Tens of kilometers of neighborhoods with zero stores from where to buy a quick snack, a pack of cigarettes, I don't know, a pack of condoms, you name it. There just aren't. If you're in a suburb and forgot to buy milk, you're fucked. You need to drive 20 to 40 kilometers to get some. Well, okay, not always 40 kilometers, but you get my point. There is no place to walk to in order to get to a convenience store, because no store is zoned as such. How in the world is that sensible? And it's funny that lefties are so super concerned about the environment, yet it's predominantly lefties who push things like these, which in turn increases the use of cars and therefore the amount of pollution. Though, of course, a lot of so-called conservatives do that too. Don't get me wrong, this is a general problem. But I found these problems more often in lefty-dominated areas, more specifically in the Yankee Dome, to use the term from Colin Woodard's book, American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures in North America. Please do read that book. I know I shilled for it in the previous video as well, but it's really good. Now, Woodard describes Yankee Dome as having a utopian streak, and upon personal observation, as well as judging by their versions of zoning laws, I gotta say Woodard hit the nail in the head. Because most of the zoning laws in the Yankee Dome kinda are like that, with a utopian streak. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not necessarily arguing against the existence of zoning guidelines, but I do argue against the excessive and overbearing format that is practiced in far too many places in the United States. In a way, it's funny. A lot of people on all sides of the political spectrum invest a tremendous amount of energy in federal politics. The left still hasn't moved over the fact that it lost the election in 2016, and the right is still busy drinking leftist tears. I mean, I get it, leftist tears are oftentimes tasty, but the fact of the matter is that the highest amount of direct oppression and breach of natural rights by the authority against the individual is done at the city hall level and not at the federal level. It would indeed be very helpful if freedom-loving Americans would invest a bit more into local politics and curb some of the idiocy there. I mean, convincing 65 million people on a whole continent to vote for your guy is difficult. Convincing 7,000 people in your community to vote against a retarded policy should be easier, methinks. On this topic, I think Europe overall, I guess with the exception of Germany, from my observations, really has it better. Even the suburbs have plenty of convenience stores and mom-and-pop stores that you can walk to. We suck at many things over here in Europe, but we got this one right, or at least slightly better, I guess. All right, number 2. The tipping culture. This has always been a pet peeve of mine, largely because I perceive tipping as inherently Ottoman, because that's how tipping got introduced to my people. It was called peşkeş in Turkish. The word is still present all over the areas where the Ottomans dominated, and I believe the word originates from Kurdish, peşkeşkirin, which means to give a present under duress. The word bakshish also still exists in many languages to this day, which means almost the same thing. And which is why I compare the tipping culture in the United States with the peşkeş of the Ottoman era. Because in the Ottoman era, the peşkeş was a present given by those subjugated by the Sultan with the occasion of the end of the Ramadan. It wasn't an entirely willing transaction, but one under duress in order to avoid pissing off the Sultan or the Emir and look bad in front of the other provinces of the empire. And I've noticed that it's the same is true with tips in the United States. The tip is not per se mandatory, but almost everyone does it because they don't want to piss off the server or look bad. That, to me, is antithetical to the capitalist spirit because it puts the client in an inherently disadvantageous position in front of the supplier, when in reality it should absolutely be the other way around. Now, I understand why this developed in the first place. I'm fully aware of the history behind it with all the minimum wage exceptions, yada yada yada, but you know what? I don't care. I really don't. I don't care. Minimum wage regulations should not exist to begin with, and in the US, the minimum wage is a legacy of legit institutional racism, by the way, but modern-day so-called anti-racists aren't busy with dismantling that, of course. They're much more interested in dismantling competence. Anyway, the whole passive-aggressive game played by way too many servers in the hospitality industry in the US for tips disgusts me to the core. And on this issue, we sure have it better in Europe, where tips are generally for exceptionally good service, not for just rendering the service for which you're already being paid. It's really funny. The inheritor of the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkish Republic, has a much weaker tipping culture today than the United States, which has the worst tipping culture in the world, according to multiple studies, and yes, according to my travels over dozens of countries. And I really mean it when I say the worst in the world. Not only the practice tips are enormous, like 20% is pretty much the norm, but it's also expected almost everywhere. In most countries I've been to, it's usually limited to restaurants and maybe taxi drivers, but in the US it's almost anything. Food delivery, hotels, taxis, even small bars, tattoo and massage parlors, car repair, turning luggage over at the airport, housekeeping, and even events where you're a guest and the host has already paid for the service and all of the services. It's insane! Not to mention, it's also making budgeting impossible since no price is really the price. What you see is not what you get. You want to eat something that says it costs $5? Tough luck, you might end up paying $8. Because the rest is tips and the so-called service tax. And good luck figuring out which one is which. Now, All of this may not sound like a big deal, but in a 1-month trip, it does add up. And that wouldn't be such a problem if it were consistent and transparent. But it's not, which makes it overall terrible. Not to mention the amount of good old-fashioned corruption that it generates. Now, the good news is that all of this is slowly starting to change. Of course, it will take decades, just like it took decades to become the norm to begin with, but the first steps are there. Increasingly, a lot of stakeholders, from managers to servers themselves to economists from all sides, are starting to question the wisdom of the tipping culture. And they should, because it is definitely unwise. In fact, tipping is not really a tradition of the US. Up until the 1920s, tipping was essentially unheard of, and it only became a legal tradition in the Great Society era. The real conservative position is really against this kind of Ottoman tier kind of practice. Number 3. More expensive than it should be. Now, this one is somewhat tied to the first two. The idea of tipping the housekeeper at the motel might not sound such a bad idea if housing for tourists hadn't been so brutally expensive. I mean, even freaking hostels with third to fourth world conditions, like any hostel really, practices prices starting from $70 a night, plus tips of course, because heaven forbid we be transparent about pricing. The conditions you get in a $70 a night hostel in a city are comparable with what you get for 10 euros a night in Berlin or 5 euros a night in Belgrade. Now, I was told that the fault for this lies in consumer paranoia, which led to the market leaning towards chains rather than independent establishments, because consumers perceived the independent ones as less than. As such, cheap hotel ended up being a slur rather than an objective description. So this is a counterpoint to the number 4 in the previous video. While it can be pretty damn cheap to live in the US, for those wanting to visit and explore the country, it's a whole lot more expensive than Europe. What you might be saving up on transport, you pay triple or quadruple on tourist housing. And by the way, you save on transport if you buy a car for the time while you're staying there. Otherwise, transport is pretty brutal too. You either go with uncomfortable buses, which at least aren't expensive, or you go by plane, and plane fares are also brutal. The American low cost is nothing like what we understand here in Europe. For a close to 1,000 kilometers flight from Chicago to Washington, D.C., flight booked 2 months ahead, it went up to almost $400 trip with checked-in luggage. More than double than what I paid for the round trip to Germany this year. Now, it is true that nominal incomes in the US are higher and the average American may not perceive this as expensive as I did, but still, the fact remains. Exploring the US is a lot more expensive than exploring Europe. Even places that are notorious for how expensive they are in Europe, like Norway or the United Kingdom or Switzerland, can still be slightly cheaper to explore than nominally poorer places in the US, like Michigan or Indiana. Number 4. The internet speed and the terrible customer service. You might remember that while I was in the US, I wanted to attend the live stream on Rocking Mysteries channel. Well, I did attend that stream, but only for half an hour. Then the internet went down and it didn't come back for 48 hours. I knew exactly what the problem was and why the connection had fallen, but after 4 hours on the phone, trying to get a technician on the phone to at least explain the issue to someone that understands networks and telecommunications, I finally dropped out. 4 hours. That did teach me a lesson though. I am now far more tolerant with the Romanian slowness on customer service. Here you get to solve most things in 20 minutes, so most people get upset when it takes 45 minutes. Now I only get upset if it exceeds 1 hour. Now, it's true that I've mentioned this in the past. In fact, it's one of my most viewed clips, the one about internet speeds. But still, that clip was made in 2015. In late 2018, things were still just as bad. And it's weird, given that the US is a much more of an online place than almost any country in Europe, really. I guess except Estonia maybe. Yet the internet speeds are still pretty low. With that said, there is some good news. Finally, in the last 4 to 6 months, broadband cable speeds in the US started growing substantially. According to speedtest.net global ranking for August, the US ranked 7th, which is much better than when I was in the US, when it was ranking 25th or even lower. So there is hope on this one. There really is. Anyway, number 5. City architecture. Now, I didn't get to see all of the cities in the US, not even the majority of them, but of those that I did get the chance to see so far, Alexandria, Virginia and the capital, Washington, D.C. are the only ones that I still remember without having to look for the footage in my personal archive. This rarely happens to me with cities in Europe, Africa or the Middle East. But in the US, the cities just don't have a reasonable architectural personality, at least from those that I got a chance to explore and see. Even Chicago, which does stand out as being a lot more European because it's an older city, is still pretty similar to others, and if not for the nice view one gets during the morning river walk, I would have forgotten that one too. Basically, if you see 2 or 3 big cities in the US, you've kind of seen them all from an architectural perspective. Now, of course, in Europe things are much more different and to a certain extent better. And some of that is an immutable characteristic. After all, Europe is made of history and the United States is made of risk. That's why we call it the New World. But it doesn't have to be that way forever, and I would argue it shouldn't be that way. I've talked to US builders just to make sure I don't get this wrong, and they've confirmed that it is neither illegal nor really more expensive to build with a bit more class and style. Yet for some reason, very few buildings that have that outside of the really old ones. And by really old ones, I mean by American standards, which can mean stuff built in the 1940s. I don't know why so many builders choose an essentially brutalist style, but it's ugly. It's aesthetically repulsive. Just cube after cube after cube after cube, only differing by their shining lights applied post factum or maybe a slightly different color in painting. Terrible. The good news is that Americans are much more accustomed to tearing apart entire neighborhoods and rebuilding them in ways that it's hardly imaginable in Europe, really. So the shift to a classier style might take a lot less than it would take in Europe. All you need is an influx of better ideas in terms of the aesthetics of buildings. Will those ideas come? Maybe. Though I'm not optimistic, to be honest. If anything, those ideas, the American ideas, are being exported to Europe. This May, when I was in Berlin, I couldn't believe my eyes how many soulless cubes have been built, making the city uglier. And to make things worse, most of the new structures are ugly even when compared to the already ugly ones built by the Stalinist regime in East Berlin. Terrible! And why do Americans pay so much money on houses that look exactly the same? I mean, I saw some really nice neighborhoods with houses that have personality and are unique-ish in architecture, yet those sold slower and cheaper than those that looked more like some 15-year-old kid would draw the first time he'd touch AutoCAD. Why? I don't know the answer to why, but I do know it's part of the reason so many buildings in the United States are ugly. But hey, feel free to dismiss this with the good old relativistic claptrap that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, man. Though, of course, I'll call bullshit on that, because some things are objectively nicer than others. A grey, soulless cube is uglier than the building that houses the Supreme Court, or any building in Old Town Alexandria. It just is what it is. Number 6. Alcohol-related Puritanism. Just like my country is a post-communist one, the United States is a post-Puritan country. So I get it. Some terrible habits of the old order are still around because civilizational change doesn't happen overnight and cannot happen overnight. Nevertheless, the inherently puritanical vibe of alcohol laws in America struck me as absurd. You need to be 21 and show an ID even for non-alcoholic beer. For a European, that's just insane. Now, admittedly, given that I drink an average less than half a liter of any alcoholic beverage per year, this wasn't exactly a problem for me. But when the good man who helped me with the USA tour had to drive his 20-year-old son for 40 kilometers in order to buy him some vodkas and some beer for a party, that struck me as utterly insane. Especially considering that you can be drafted to fight wars at the age of 18, yet you have to wait for 3 more years before drinking a beer legally. That, my fellow deplorables, is absurd. No matter how you spin it, no matter how you try to justify it, it's still insane. There is no reasonable justification for it. There isn't. And on this issue, I think we got it a lot better in Europe. In fact, in general, when it comes to legal social freedom for young people, it's definitely better here. And not just on drinking, but anything in this department, really. I mean, in some states of the United States, you can get married at the age of 13, but you can't drink until you're 21. Give me a break. In what world does that make sense? Also on this topic, the ages of consent are unusually high too. I mean, in some states, a 20-year-old boning a 17-year-old is committing statutory rape. Really? America was built by young men, not by moralizing bitter old soccer moms. Andrew Jackson was 13 when he joined the Revolutionary War. Do you think he didn't drink or smoke? Seriously? The Puritan slant of the legislation, most of it coming from the utopian streak of the Yankeedom, clearly, has essentially made it impossible for present-day teenagers to experiment. I spoke more about that 3 years ago in the video called "Most of My Childhood is Illegal." Now, don't get me wrong. There are many such idiosyncrasies in Europe too. We are far from perfect, but things make slightly more sense here most of the time. And surely we don't police vice as harsh as the US, and in my opinion, that is a good thing. Number 7, paranoia about children. Now, a lot of authors have written about this and a lot more have spoken about this, so I won't go into much details, but I really like countries where you can observe children roaming around. I learned a lot about how Zimbabwe functions and will be functioning very soon by observing the behavior of its teenagers. Just an example. Same goes for Serbia or Jordan or Israel. It allows for knowledge about the future of that country. I couldn't get much of that in the US though. In the US, even saying that you want to observe children brings in dubious questions, and that is terrible. You don't see many kids on the block, like at all. And part of it is, of course, the fault of the parents, which over time developed a sense of paranoia that I simply cannot empathize with, no matter how much I try. I understand its logic, but I still find it repulsive more often than not. I remember what a splash Lenore Skenazy made back in 2008 with her big story of just letting her 9-year-old ride the metro alone. And at that time I was less wise myself and I didn't understand what was the big deal, because here 9 or 10-year-olds ride the public transport alone all the time and nobody bats an eyelid. It's entirely unremarkable, and it was so in 2008 as well. Since then, however, I learned and lived a lot more and understood what Lenore Skenazy had figured it out, that the American society was getting brutally insane on this topic. And she was right. Unfortunately, I think it has gotten worse since 2008. She did start an organization called Let Grow, which she promotes, she promotes childhood independence, self-reliance, and resilience. She's the one who came up with the term free-range parenting, which from my perspective is just basically, I don't know, normal childhood. But in addition to the stubbornness of the parents, there is also the issue of legislation, which is significantly more insane now than it was in 2008. Ironically, Lenore Skenazy's experiment would be illegal today, and it's getting progressively worse and contradictory. You can't let your child alone at home at age 7, but you can get him pumped up with opposite-sex hormones, sterilize him, and set him up for a lifetime of impersonation of the opposite sex. And that's progressive, stunning, and brave. In some places, the state even regulates the maximum age when you can go trick or treat. Imagine that! And I'm not joking. Now, we don't do trick or treat here, but we do something similar on December the 24th and or December the 31st. The only ones trying to stop that were the communists. Thank God we helicoptered those. Well, sadly, not all of them, but enough of them that the state doesn't care how teenagers spend the holiday. The media likes to whine about non-citizen children being separated from their criminal non-citizen parents at the border, but the state separates a lot of children from their citizen parents all the time, and oftentimes for insane reasons. Kids can be, and routinely are, essentially kidnapped from home by the state for trivial reasons, like 11-year-olds playing alone at home, some basketball in their own backyard. They've been kidnapped by the state. It happened to a couple in Florida. A so-called concerned citizen called the CPS, arguing that the kids are being tortured because their parents got stuck in traffic on their way home from work. And the kids were technically without food, shelter, and a bathroom. Can you imagine the horror? They had to kick the ball around for 30 to 50 minutes until the parents got home to unlock the house. What a terrible tragedy. The state had to intervene, you see. I'll leave some links in the low bar with the stories and more reading material, of course. But the point I'm trying to make here is that even when the parents themselves are not insane, the laws still are. And this is a negative development that occurred relatively recently. It wasn't the case 50 years ago. Heck, it wasn't the case in late 1990s either. But it is now. And I realize it is a complex topic, but at the same time I find it astonishing that so few freedom-loving Americans are involved in addressing this. They are out there, mind you, but they're surprisingly uncoordinated and their agitprop game is really weak. And that's largely because most conversations about this start from the premise that things like the CPS are necessary, and most of the proposals are centered around more laws and more clarity, when in reality, in the game of propaganda, you don't start with this. You start from the premise that all of it should be helicoptered and devolve the power back to communities and families rather than the state. If anything, over time, the state has gotten better at propaganda. Every 6 months, the cathedral runs a story about the plight of the so poor caseworkers, the people whose job is literally to tear families apart and kidnap children. Now, don't get me wrong, there are such extreme things in Europe too, but it is generally contained to Scandinavia. Norway's Barnevernet and the equivalent in Finland are by far the worst. Germany is also pretty terrible place to be a normal person and a parent at the same time. But with that said, most of the rest of Europe, East and West, is a lot nicer, and as a result there's less paranoia about children. Can this be fixed? Yes, but it will take a lot more than expected, because it's not just bad laws, it's also fundamentally false and downright terrifying beliefs that way too many parents hold themselves. In a way, fighting the insanity in Norway and Finland is easier because at the very least most people already recognize the laws as being insane. So it's a people versus the state fight. In the US, it's much more complicated because significant portions of the people are also on the side of the state. And that is terrible. Number 8, the cheesiness of language. Now, I don't need to dwell too much on this. Americans who watch this channel already know that it's a problem, and it's not like I'm the first one to notice it. Nevertheless, it still struck me even though I knew this will be the case. If I were to compare, the USA is on the opposite extreme of the Netherlands. The Dutch will be brutally honest 100% of the time. Their approach to life is fairly direct, and if you don't like it, they couldn't care less. Americans in the Netherlands have some of the biggest cultural shocks on this issue. The opposite is true in the US, where euphemisms reign supreme even on the individual level. Even with people you know really well, most people will simply avoid being honest in face-to-face conversations, and that is terrible. And it's probably why there's this whole dance of pretending to be shocked with what one sees online. Because at least in the online world, people can be honest. Conversely, in Europe, the shock is lower because we're accustomed to meeting people who are direct about what they mean and what they believe. One of the reasons the current president is Donald Trump is precisely because he didn't exactly get the memo on this issue. But even Donald Trump is full of cheesy language. But at least he has the excuse of being so many years in the show business. But what's the excuse of everyone else? Everything has to be awesome and great. It's almost like words like terrible, insane, shitty, bad, or crap have been excised from the spoken language. And then there's all of the business with the fake smiles. After several dozens of countries, I know when a smile is legit and when it isn't. And haven't seen too many legit smiles in the US because I have seen several hundreds of thousands of fake smiles. To the point that I've become an expert on the details of fake smiles. I guess I shouldn't be complaining. I gathered valuable knowledge out of this flaw after all. But seriously, honesty needs to be made great again in the good old USA. It's great that Americans are polite, I love it, but the cheesiness and the fake smiles and the whole over-the-top language, that has to go. It's ruining it. Number 9, the public transport, or lack thereof. On one hand, I get it. Geography doesn't exactly help. But, on the other hand, with few exceptions, cities are essentially built as if humans don't exist, or as if cars are a natural extension of humans. And that's terrible. Basically, even in the middle of a big city that sort of has some public transport, you're still kind of fucked without a car. Moreover, many cities have huge portions where sidewalks simply don't exist at all. I had 2 encounters with the police while in the US, excluding airports. One of them was because the police officer thought I was drunk or sick. I was neither. Why did he think that? Because I was walking. It's not like I was walking where I shouldn't have, but simply because I was walking in an area where the sidewalk essentially didn't exist because apparently nobody walks there. Now, of course, this is a chicken and egg story, which came first? Nobody walked there, as a result no sidewalk was built, or no sidewalk was built and as a result nobody walked there. Anyway, the point is that the US is not a pedestrian-friendly country at all, and generally not friendly for those unwilling or unable to drive. And that sucks balls. The American idea of a walkable city looks like New York, Chicago, or Washington, D.C. Well, I've been to all 3 and I remain thoroughly unimpressed, except DC, which is indeed walkable even by my definition. But important and relevant landmarks of Chicago are almost impossible to access without a car, and once you go out a little bit from the downtown area, you're toast. And if you want to go to another city, let's say you want to walk from DC to Alexandria, which is just 11 kilometers, which I can walk in under 2 hours without sweating, well, if you want to do that, there's no way to do that. But at least you can take a cheap train from DC to Alexandria, which is great. Not so great if you want to go anywhere inland. You either fly or own a car. Very few buses with thoroughly irregular schedule, and most interesting sites are not covered by the rudimentary intercity public transport. And it's really a shame given that the roads are there, and it's not like some huge investment, public or private, needs to be made in order to connect the country by public transport. Keep in mind that when I say public, I mean it accessible to the public, not necessarily government-owned or government-operated. In fact, government should stay out of this business, really. One gets luckier if one lives or travels in the vicinity of an Amtrak railway. Contrary to popular opinion, trains are a thing in the US, and they're really not that expensive either, nor supremely slow. But then again, I compare with a lot of countries, and for a territorially large country, the American trains are quite good. I mean, you can get from New York to Miami for as little as $160 by train. That's not bad at all for a 2,000 kilometers trip. My problem is that there aren't enough of them. On some crowded destinations, let's say between Chicago and New York, just one train a day? That's kind of terrible. Needs more. And finally, number 10, the media. Now, don't get me wrong, I despise most of the European cathedral media as well, but the American media really, really sucks. The only country where it's worse is Germany, out of the countries that I have visited or am able to read the media, mind you, so I don't know enough about the media in Mongolia. Maybe that one is worse than both. But seriously, beyond the jokes that I like to make about the media and also the criticism that I often intentionally exaggerate when I levy them against the media, the American press really, really sucks balls. I can identify at least one media outlet that I enjoy reading from any country in Europe. I can't really identify one in the US. I don't know, maybe the Epoch Times? But that one is hardly mainstream. But okay, let's say the Epoch Times. It's the only newspaper I read in the US that didn't leave me with the feeling that I should be applying for a helicopter pilot license in order to proceed with free rides for the whole freaking newsroom. And when I say the media, it's not just the New York Times, a former newspaper, and currently a conspiracist blog way beneath Natural News or InfoWars, but it's all of them. And the same goes for TV. I mean, with all due respect for Fox News, but being ever so slightly less insane than MSLSD is not good enough. And to make things worse, this has extended to non-American English language outlets too. On one hand, this is good for me because now I have to practice my other languages more often because there's hardly anything interesting to read news-wise in English. But on the other hand, it's terrible for the American people. I mean, most of life in America is pretty peaceful, pretty quiet, and pretty abundant, and that's great. But you wouldn't know that if you're watching the American media. The levels of exaggeration have become unbearable. We have 24-hour news stations here too, but even the worst of them are still not as hysterical as the news networks are in the United States. And I am a news junkie. For about 320 days a year, I read at least 50 news items a day, and on average about 80. And in many days I read more than 150, so I'm accustomed to a lot of news, slanted and biased reporting, and with general journal hysteria. But even I, a veteran on this, think the American media is too much. So it is no wonder, to me at least, that regular Americans are tuning out entirely in the oh-so-American attitude of, you know what, fuck this shit. And European analysts are quite wrong when they compare the level of trust in the media in the US with the one in Europe. Guys, you don't understand. While there are driving factors that coincide with ours, Americans have an extra reason that by and large either doesn't exist or it's significantly tamer here. Their media just bloody sucks. Now, this isn't the first time this happened, that's why I'm not that terribly worried over the long run, but this might be the first time when the media going wrong will leave a much longer negative impact. Way too many Americans internalized attitudes and beliefs that were and are completely alien to the American ethos. That's not progress. That's a recipe for discontent. This is where, in my opinion, the biggest harm by the media can be identified. Not in politics, not in laws passed, not even in many attitudes, but in mental health. More Americans feel frightened, lonely, and discontented than 30 years ago, even though there are fewer objective reasons today for any of that. Luckily, the internet does help. It's not perfect, it's not a panacea, but it's a damn good start. Nevertheless, the American mainstream media is so terrible that it deserved a spot on my list. Seriously, some of those clowns calling themselves journalists should have been helicoptered into Atlantic or the Pacific in the case of LA a long time ago. And the fact that they haven't been helicoptered speaks volumes about the inherently good-spirited and optimistic nature of the American people. So yeah, that's basically the list of 10 things. I found to be quite bad in the United States. Of course, the list is not complete and it's the result of the experience of one individual. That's why I didn't get into more complicated matters, because on those, even though I have a bit of knowledge, I didn't get to experience them enough, or to experience them to begin with. Maybe I should have mentioned lawsuits too. The way Americans do this is entirely alien for most Europeans, but that's not necessarily wrong, so yeah, it actually didn't belong on the list. Good thing I didn't include it. So yeah, what's your view on this? What did you find in the US that kinda sucked? The question is, of course, primarily to non-Americans, though no one tells Americans what to do, so Americans are invited to chip in as well. Ideally, when making a comment, please keep in mind the golden question: compared to what? Because it's a good mechanism to keep the criticism in check. Many American leftists like to criticize America for things that nobody gets better. And they get away with this because they compare it to an ideal standard that never existed and will never exist, and also because they rely on the ignorance of the audience. But I hold my audience in a much higher regard than I hold American leftists, or leftists really. So please do keep in mind to qualify and compare. With all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.